Thank you for this question. And the system shifting paper that we published was published with Jenny Winhall, who I think is worth connecting to in order to deepen the answer I will give you. So I encourage you also to follow her and her contributions, because in a way, she used to work for the Design Council when I worked at the Design Council in 2005. And so her perspective on this, and Cassie Robinson, who is also a contributor to that paper's perspective on this, are coming from trying to make service design make sense over a long period of time within organizational cultures that might be public organizational cultures. So our systemic design framework is there to help designers think a little bit outside of the box. We say outside of the box. It's not usually a box. But the focus is on a method and a way of working. The system shifting paper is on a way of thinking and a way of considering the impact of systemic work. And I think those two things are different. The way of thinking about system shifting is to be aware of one's conditions and one's systemic work to begin with. The reason why I focused my presentation on our systemic design framework is I think unless you do that systemic design first and you attempt to even change the way in which you're doing design to begin with, you cannot really start to think about shifting systems. You have to sort of go for the first step and then try to think, well, can I shift the system through the work I am doing? But unless that systemic work starts to become as simple as designing packaging, designing a car, designing a neighborhood or a building, then to shift systems is political work for me. It is very much political work. And I think the invitation of that paper is to engage politically in ways that most designers are uncomfortable with. Most designers do not want to do political work. They want to create something beautiful. They want to engage with users. They want to do a level of social engineering, if I use a very specific word. But to shift systems, you have to get involved politically. So this is why I ended my presentation by mentioning the fact that we now have design departments in government, because that is one of the first steps, is to at least introduce the concept of design work into governmental structures so that systems which are partly social, partly governmental, partly infrastructural can be changed by the presence of a designer. But the designer has to decide to take on that political work. And I don't think that you are ready for that work until you have done systemic work first. I think systemic design can happen no matter whether you think you are addressing the climate emergency or not. Mm-hmm. I think that would be my personal answer to this. Yes. You can do systemic work on a project that has something to do with young people and economic access,
Right.
without thinking about the ecological dimensions of the project or addressing them clearly. If
Mhm.
you're going to be doing transition design, generally speaking, you have a net zero transition objective. It
Right.
might link to your local net zero objectives in your country, and you are going to tie yourself to that more. The
Mhm.
challenge, I suppose, is whose definition of transition, what definition of net zero, is it the correct definition of net zero, etc.
Mhm.
Versus taking a systemic approach where your work that you might be doing with a young, with young people in a poor community,
Mhm.
then you will immediately integrate their environment, their health, the health of their community economically, ecologically. You will do that transition work anyway, I think, but you can choose not to. Whereas I think the transition design ties you to that ecological impact, and it might even be that it ties you to carbon emission impact. So you might be specifically looking to reduce carbon emissions by a certain number. Whereas your systemic work, I think you will have a more rounded view, I think, of a project. I think we're in the beginning, and thank you for your question. I think we're in the beginning of thinking in those terms. Two projects I will mention which want to address this. One, which is a design studio called Dark Matter Labs, which I'm sure you're aware of. They are an architecture practice, but they take systemic approaches to design practice, systemic approaches to the impact of design work, and they have been publishing a lot on contracts and ways of seeing the value of design contracts. So that's taking the underlying economic model of architecture work and trying to shift it. So they are an example of one, they're a small business, they're, I think, 50 people, but it's one example of something happening here. We are, of course, in very difficult times in the UK economically, very difficult times politically, and in a cost of energy crisis that is very harsh. So can I say that governmental structures and our design in government departments are shifting anything right now? No. They are fundamentally trying to survive and as departments, and trying to make sure that basic services are able to survive very aggressive cuts from government. So Jenny Winhall, however, who is the co-author of the paper, is based in Denmark. And Denmark has a very different view of social services, of public provision and the state. And that environment, I think, lends itself more to conversation around system shifting. Also because the population of Denmark is much smaller than in the UK. Japan and the UK, I think, are the same in terms of population sizes. And so we know that those are, the bigger the population, the more challenges there are. And I think the more shifting entire systems becomes harder. But you can start, as Dark Matter Labs are doing, you can start in at the project level and try to shift the discourse first and then the work second. So you change the conversation first, and then slowly people see shifts in ways of working, ways of commissioning design, and ways of measuring impact of design differently. What we keep an eye on, because we keep mostly an eye on what is happening in the United Kingdom,
Right.
I can say that organizations like Civic Square, for example, are organizations that are trying to shift the way in which, for example, neighborhood retrofitting, so improving of houses and the way in which houses are built, they are trying to shift the system around how those are commissioned, but it is extremely challenging. They are very, very close to dark matter labs as well as an organization. So I have mentioned the same organization twice, which means there's not a lot going on yet.
Right.
But this will, I think, will continue to expand as time goes by. We are expecting probably a shift in government in our next elections, which will be possibly friendlier to this kind of work as well. And I think that is also a big system shift when governments change, and they change the condition for this kind of work. I think we are always interested in challenging ourselves to use the double diamond differently and to expand in a way. The double diamond is the simplest expression, and both the system shifting paper and the design value paper start to build new language and start to build new processes around that double diamond, and so complexify the double diamond, let's say. I think this is because we are aware of the critics of the double diamond as being too simple. So it was very effective in 2004 to speak of the double diamond as a simplification that was useful for designers to speak to non-designers. But if we are encouraging new ways of working, we feel comfortable to building new language and new processes and to have a discussion because of the paper. We are not an academic institution in that way, and we are always interested in how people use what we publish, build on what we publish, and criticize what we publish as well. So the use of the double diamond language, we felt, because we are in a time of emergency with the climate, we felt more comfortable shifting the language as we are asking people to act differently and design differently. So the double diamond is very useful for some contexts, and especially when we speak to clients who have very limited understanding of design. So I think it still does a good job of explaining something complex in a simple way. So I think it will still have a place. But for designers who already know about the double diamond, maybe they have opinions, maybe they have their own frameworks, their own tools, then the systemic design framework is there to talk to those professionals. It's not really useful for us to drop the double diamond. It's useful for us to have a number of different approaches that we champion, and a number of different approaches that have different audiences. Double Diamond is still very useful for non-design audiences and for design audiences, especially academic audiences. It's useful to have other approaches. So. Thank you for your question. Because systemic design is new, the feedback that we are currently getting comes from academia. Right. And I think personally, I think this is very interesting because it means that this is in a way very far away from practice and very far away from day-to-day practice of, let's say, a mid-career designer. Mm-hmm. I think a young designer has more chances of hearing about systemic design in their education, maybe. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this is maybe if they do a master's degree, and I'm not even sure if they do a bachelor's degree, they would hear about this. But at a master's degree, they might hear about it. If they are already in practice, I think they will not have heard about it yet. Right. And so this is why most of the feedback we are having is from systemic design researchers and people who do systemic design work in academia already, who, you know, either have liked it or have challenged it or think it's, you know, X, Y, and Z. We're perfectly comfortable with not trying to please everyone. We are trying to at least make approachable some of these methods to someone who might be curious over time and maybe is a mid-career designer. So what we are doing right now is commissioning workshop tools to help someone who is mid-career use this paper very practically. So those workshop tools should be published by the end of next month, where they will be examples of you have 1 hour with your client and you want to do something interesting that touches on the systemic dimensions of the project. This is what you do. You have 3 hours. This is this other thing you can do. And then you have a choice. We are aiming between 3 and 5 workshop tools that will be published and working with someone who designs workshop tools. So who knows really and who will be able to get feedback from mid-career designers who don't have a lot of time, want things to be very easy to understand, very easy to adapt into their existing way of working with their clients. And so I think this is where the Design Council's role is most important, is in the beginning of the journey. Because then once someone has built up knowledge and expertise, other people have more specific tools. Academic partners do this for a living. We can point to other sources, but we're there to help people at least get on the journey. I think there's a lot that you can do with students. For example, to firstly do what we did with the designers that we interviewed for the paper, for example, which is to ask them what are some of the challenges that they see around, for example, addressing the climate emergency. And even for them to vocalize this as people first, designers second, citizens third, I think could be very interesting in helping create briefs for students. I think you could ask the same question of non-designers and especially of the clients who commission designers to say, how do you think about the challenges of addressing climate change in your organization, in order to see if there are trends, to see if there are areas that would change the way in which the design brief is done or the design activity is led. I think you can ask those open-ended questions in a way to, again, reframe the brief or expand that activity of what design looks like, because really the system shifting paper and the systemic design framework are there to reimagine what design looks like as an activity. So I think those open-ended questions can really help. I think there are ways of doing this that don't feel too difficult, and I think this is important. It can't feel like something that is too far away. You can place a systemic challenge on a student in very simple ways that immediately activates creativity to say your project or product will only be able to operate for 6 hours during the day because we have power cuts in the evenings, and so you now have to design for a world where you have very little energy or electricity on a day-to-day basis, and the item or the product has to be repairable from day one with the tools that your grandmother has in her shed. You know, like simple kind of, suddenly they start to sort of open things up to say, okay, I'm not designing for myself. I'm not designing for this brief. I'm not designing for my teacher, and I'm not designing for my student friends. I'm designing with grandma in mind. What does grandma have? Does grandma have a screwdriver? I'm going to have to ask her. And then, okay, energy. Okay, and how much power cuts? Okay, the kinds of power cuts they have in Nigeria all the time. Okay, let me look that up. And I think there are ways of getting, in a way, a student to look above the immediate task and get them to think about these things as not even being that exotic. They're not unusual. They're actually really tied to, for example, in Europe, we have the right to repair laws that are coming into the European system. They're coming into the US as well. And we have power cuts now in the UK. So it's not these are not, I think, unusual, but I feel like we protect students from these dimensions all the time. We want to protect them from understanding their future challenges in real ways. And I think when they are safe in school is exactly the right time not to protect them and to really place these challenges at their feet and say, come on, do something great with this. Thank you for this very challenging question. I think it's very hard for me sitting in a very gray day in London to think about your culture and its richness in ways that would be useful to you. But I think when you think of the system as being too big to shift, I think then I would think about the different ways in which people have challenged the system in small ways. And I think of some of the community work that has happened in our part of the world. either that is, this morning, for example, one of my colleagues was sharing some housing schemes for older women so that they can live in communities together. These are architectural projects that have a social dimension that is very different to the usual ways in which you could see later life. I know that this will mean different things in a Japanese context, but it's an invitation, I think, both the systemic design framework and the system shifting paper to be a bit more punk and to be a bit more, in a way, anti-establishment, but without necessarily becoming anarchists. I think there's a nice line there. And I think exploring that line in ways that are comfortable culturally, comfortable socially, but start to show that a different way is possible, and that those different ways you will need to explore within your culture and within what comfort means for you. And I think that's the beauty of doing design work within a culture, within systems, is it kind of doesn't matter what I can do in my culture, in my system. It really matters what you think you can change in yours. And because you know it and you know its limitations or its challenges, I think you're in a good place, not so much to learn from me, but to really do your own thing and do it in a, again, in a way that's a bit punk.